A doorway in Turkey where animals mysteriously drop dead, an island crawling with thousands of virus-carrying monkeys, and a shrine so sacred even world leaders aren't allowed to see it. These are prohibited places on Earth you are never allowed to visit. Deep in the ruins of an ancient city in Turkey, there's a stone doorway that people used to call the Gate to Hell. Thousands of years ago, the Romans and Greeks believed that the god of the dead, Pluto, lived on the other side of it. They'd hold these terrifying public demonstrations where priests would lead bulls or goats up to the opening, and without anyone ever touching them, the animals would suddenly collapse and die. But the priests, they could walk right in and come out totally fine, which made it look like they had some sort of divine power. For hundreds of years, people thought this was just a scary legend, but modern researchers decided to go there with gas sensors to see what was actually happening, if anything. Well, they discovered that there's actually something geological going on. The cave is sitting right on top of a deep crack in the Earth's crust that leaks massive amounts of carbon dioxide. Because CO2 is heavier than air, it settles into a thick invisible layer right at the floor of the cave. During the day, the sun thins the gas out, but at night and in the early morning, the concentration is so high that it can kill a human in minutes. The reason the ancient priests survived was because they were tall. Their heads were above the gas cloud, while the shorter animals they let inside were breathing in the poison at ground level. Today, the site is still heavily fenced off because even though we know why it happens, that invisible gas layer is still super dangerous. Just off the coast of Beaufort, South Carolina, there's an island that looks like a beautiful green paradise from a boat, but if you try to step onto the sand, you'll be stopped by armed patrols. It's called Morgan Island, and it's inhabited by over 4,000 monkeys. What are a bunch of monkeys doing on an island in the United States, though? They were brought there in 1979 from a research center in Puerto Rico. At the time, the center was struggling with a massive outbreak of viruses, and the government needed a place to isolate a clean breeding colony for medical testing. They chose this remote marshland because the monkeys couldn't easily swim to the mainland. The reason the public is strictly banned is for public safety. Most of these monkeys carry the herpes B virus. In monkeys, this virus is basically like a common cold, but if it jumps to a human through a bite or a scratch, it attacks the central nervous system. Without immediate treatment, it has an 80% fatality rate. They also just don't want people going to the island and messing with the monkeys. They've completely taken over the island and are extremely territorial. They'll drop down from trees and swarm anyone they don't recognize. I mean, imagine getting mobbed by a bunch of angry, wild, herpes-ridden monkeys. Not very fun. In a dense forest in Japan, there's a wooden complex that's considered the most sacred spot in the entire country. Dedicated to the sun goddess, and it's where the Japanese imperial family keeps their most prized possession, a legendary sacred mirror. You can hike through the surrounding park and get close to the outer wooden walls, but that's where your journey is going to end. The shrine is surrounded by 4 layers of high wooden fences, and only the highest-ranking priests and the emperor's family are allowed to step into the inner sanctum. Even the most powerful world leaders have been turned away at the gates because the ground itself is considered too sacred. There's an interesting tradition that's been happening every 20 years for over a millennium. Instead of repairing the old buildings, Japanese workers build an identical version of the shrine on an empty plot right next to the current one. Once the new one is perfect, they move the goddess's spirit and the sacred treasures into the new building and then tear the old one down to the ground. This has happened 62 times since the year 690. Because of this, the wood always looks brand new, but the actual design, it hasn't changed at all, and that's kind of cool. I mean, seeing an ancient building up close is amazing, no doubt, but this is an odd, unique case. You're kind of looking at a place that's simultaneously 1,300 years old and less than 20 years old. Back in the early 70s, Varosha was the place to be. It was a high-end resort city where celebrities like Elizabeth Taylor went on vacation. It was full of luxury hotels and brand new car dealerships. But in 1974, a war broke out between Greece and Turkey. As the Turkish army approached the city, all 40,000 residents dropped what they were doing and ran for their lives, thinking they'd be back in a few days, but they never returned. The Turkish military put up barbed wire fences around the entire district, and it's been sitting like that ever since. It looks a bit like a post-apocalyptic movie set. Because it was sealed off so quickly, though, the city is this perfect time capsule of 1974. For a long time, there were car showrooms with vintage cars that still had new car stickers on the windows, covered in layers of rust and dust. The cars were removed a few years back, though, but pretty much everything else is still standing exactly where it was, minus the people, of course. In the middle of Manhattan, surrounded by skyscrapers and busy traffic, sits the Morgan Library. Most people go there to look at old books in the public rooms, but deep underground is this massive, high-security vault. This was the personal collection of J.P. Morgan, one of the richest and most powerful bankers to ever live. He didn't just collect money, he collected the rarest, most influential objects he could find. The library shows off some items, but the deepest parts of the vault are completely off limits to everyone except a tiny handful of curators. The security is more intense than most banks, with thick steel doors and constant surveillance. Inside are apparently original musical scores handwritten by Mozart, journals from famous explorers that were never published, and ancient religious texts, not to mention rumors of even crazier stuff. In the middle of a quiet residential neighborhood in Yokohama, Japan, there's a massive decaying building called the Negishi Grandstand, the last remaining piece of a horse racing track that was once the pride of Japan. After World War II, the US military took over the area and used the grandstand as a printing press and an office building, but eventually just walked away from it in the 80s. Even though it's surrounded by parks where families play, the building is strictly off limits. The government hasn't torn it down because it's a protected historical site, but they won't open it either because it's a bit of a death trap. Inside, it's a maze of rotting floors and rusted machinery with thick layers of bird crap that have become toxic over time. There are deep elevator shafts with no doors, staircases that lead to nowhere. If you try to hop the fence, you'll find that the local police and security guards are pretty strict. They monitor the perimeter constantly because the building is so unstable. If you look out into the water, the coast of England, you might see what looks like a bunch of giant rusted metal things standing in the ocean. They're called the Maunsell Sea Forts, built during World War II to shoot down German planes and spot sea mines. They're massive concrete and steel towers perched on stilts, completely isolated from the mainland. While they served their purpose during the war, they were abandoned by the military in the 50s and left to rot ever since. You might think you could just boat out there and explore, but the British government's made it very clear these forts are prohibited. Metal is rusted so badly that the walkways between the towers have mostly snapped off, fallen into the sea. If you tried to climb up, the ladders would probably crumble in your hands. Inside, the rooms are filled with the remains of military equipment and nests of thousands of seabirds. And it gets even more complicated when you consider that some of these forts sit out in international waters. That's led to all kinds of legal chaos, so probably just have to look at these through binoculars. For years, the Gonjiam Psychiatric Hospital was known as one of the most haunted places in South Korea. The story that went around was that patients were dying mysteriously, and the owner of the hospital fled the country to escape the police. In reality, or the official story, the hospital closed in the 90s due to boring economic problems like sewage issues and lack of funding, but that didn't stop the legends from growing. The building became a magnet for ghost hunters, so the place ended up getting shut down completely. Even though the building was actually demolished a few years ago, the land is still strictly prohibited. Before it was torn down, the owners installed high-tech cameras, motion sensors, and thick barbed wire to keep people out. Even now that the building is gone, the site is under constant watch though. The Willard Asylum for the Chronic Insane in New York was a massive complex where thousands of people were sent when they had nowhere else to go. When the facility closed in 1995, workers went up into the attic of one of the administrative buildings, found something heartbreaking. Over 400 suitcases belonging to patients who'd been admitted between 1910 and 1960. These people had arrived at the asylum with their whole lives packed into a bag, only to never leave again. Their suitcases were just moved to the attic and forgotten for all that time. Parts of the old asylum are now used as a state prison. Some are open to tours, but the specific areas where these personal artifacts were found are strictly off limits to the public. The state keeps this site highly restricted to protect the privacy of the former patients and because the old buildings are just full of asbestos and lead paint. The Beelitz-Heilstätten Sanatorium is a massive complex of 60 buildings outside of Berlin. It started as a place to treat people with tuberculosis and later became a massive military hospital for the Germans and then the Soviets. It's most famous for being the place where a certain evil, soon-to-be dictator was treated for a leg wound during World War I. After the Soviet Union collapsed, the place was basically left to rot, with endless empty hallways and old surgery rooms just sitting there untouched. Now most of it is completely off limits. You can walk along this treetop path and look down at everything from above, but the actual buildings are sealed. Inside, the floors are falling apart, covered in peeling paint and moss, and the basements are usually filled with like nasty, stagnant water. They've even got security guards and dogs patrolling the area because people kept sneaking in and getting hurt exploring the collapsing rooms. And that has been the video. I will catch you, yes you specifically, in the next one.